Hello, happy Tuesday. Welcome back to another episode of The Practice. This show is an unrehearsed look into my workflow. My name's Stuart. I'm a 3D artist, illustrator, and designer, and your pal, and I'm excited, as always, to have you guys back with me this week. As you can see in the recording, we're working on a little humanoid face in this week's episode, and we're going to be sculpting this guy and adding some sort of psychedelic geometric patterns sort of coming out of his head and around his mind. And it's really fun to put together. As you may have noticed, that before I hopped into sculpt mode, I changed the types of segments that were on the sphere, because most of the time when we have your typical like hemispherical projection of these segments, it creates some inconsistent placement of the wireframes, of the geometry itself, and that has led to strange issues in like sort of edge breaks and the way the Phong tag is read. And so what I tried this week, and it seemed to give me pretty good results, is actually changing that projection to something that would triangulate nicely when we added it to the sculpt tool and added it to sculpt mode and started doing subdivisions, which gave us triangles and has led to much smoother geometry ultimately. So we've sculpted a really sort of simple, fairly streamlined, but a bit realistic of a head here. We added some eyes, and we've used some sweeps to make a little mouth here. We're just sort of tweaking position, and I wanted a nice gentle smile. It's almost as if this person is meditating. So they've got their eyes closed, they've got a nice gentle smile. And then we're adding in a really simple sort of geometric torso and neck. I didn't have I had a rough idea of the type of image I wanted to make this week, but didn't have like a super specific sketch. And so things wind up changing, ultimately wind up removing this neck and shoulder area because it just wasn't working with the composition. I started out here centered. I figured I wanted a radially symmetrical image. And I wind up changing my mind. And that's okay. That happens as we're creating and working. And I would say, if an image isn't working, don't be afraid to change it. No one's going to be mad at you. And so what I also start doing here, and a lot of this doesn't wind up in the final image, is just sort of sketching out some shapes to start sweeping. The sketch tool is really great, especially if you've got a Wacom tablet or are handy with a mouse, because you can really just draw in little shapes and throw them in a sweep, and they wind up working pretty well. This one on the right here, I think I don't ultimately wind up using. It wasn't flowing very nicely, but the second one I do wind up using, and I wind up stacking a ton of really simple primitives around it. That's sort of what we're getting into now. Well, not before adding some very simple ears to our friend here. And this one was fun. It's been cool to look back and see how it sort of evolved. There you can see I get away from that radial symmetry, that really centered type of composition, and I think it allowed the forms in the face to read a little bit better, and I think it was just a little bit more interesting overall going this way. So now we're getting a little bit closer to sort of the final look of the piece. Adding in some lighting via a physical sky. And I didn't want the shadows to be super severe. I wanted this to be a little bit of a flat piece. So I go ahead and add some luminance to the materials there. I wind up just dragging and dropping the color channel over into the luminance channel. Just a nice little speed up your workflow tip. So I'm adjusting the colors of the shadows just to sort of lighten those up a bit, make them a little softer, bumping up the intensity of the globe in the sky object, the sky itself instead of the sun. And here we start getting into those primitives that I mentioned. And originally, my idea was to have a really colorful sort of psychedelic set of shapes coming around this character's head. And I wound up keeping the color palette fairly simple, actually. Because I wanted the forms to do a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of interest. And I thought that the color could be simple, and we could focus really just on the combination of these shapes and forms and how they come together. We're just copying and duplicating and pushing these things around. It'll take a minute to compile these into, an arrangement of shapes that works well. Adding a little squiggle here. Always a fun shape. It's nice, and one of the reason I added this sort of squiggly line is because we had these sort of long straight capsules, and I thought to balance that shape, it would be nice to have something that was a little more curvy and rectilinear, as opposed to something that's so straight edged. This is really another one of those exercises in taking some rather simple shapes and combining them in a way that creates more interest than the shapes would on their own, right? And so we're keeping the color palette and the types of primitives that I'm using fairly simple, fairly consistent. But it's sort of a challenge for myself to really set up some constraints and see if I can still make a piece work with those constraints included. And so I had to fight it a little bit here in terms of, making things work. Sometimes sometimes things come together really, really quickly, and everything just sort of falls into place. And with this one, the composition didn't come together perfectly right away. And you see, I make tweaks, and I push and I pull, and I'm sort of fighting with the shapes a little bit. But to be honest, I enjoy that process. It's sort of a calming, relaxing process. I get to just sort of hang out alone with these primitives and push them and pull them and arrange them in a way that creates a satisfying piece. And I don't know about you guys, but for me, it's kind of fun. It's sort of calming. It's sort of soothing to know that, eventually this will be a worthwhile piece. Didn't start off that way, and at this point, I see that there's some promise in it, but it's obviously not quite there yet. Got a little bit too much negative space. The negative space we do have isn't quite interesting enough, but that's part of the process. But what I do really spend a lot of time when I'm making a piece like this, especially the stuff off to the top right, all these forms and shapes, I do take a lot of time to make sure that the negative space and the way they're overlapping is just so. You can see that right there I lost the neck and shoulders. I thought, this is an awfully abstract piece to begin with, so the floating head is going to be just fine in terms of quote unquote realism. We're not really going for realism here, so I didn't mind having a floating head at all. And I thought since we're going to be creating this crazy mass of shapes that sort of floats off to the top right of the composition, it might be nice to have the negative space open across the bottom left side of the composition. The top right is full and busy, and the bottom left is calm and open, and I think that creates a sense of balance. Now you see, for example, like what I was talking about before in terms of overlapping and arranging these things just so. You'll see with these squiggly shapes, the pink squiggly shapes towards the top here, the way they overlap that blue torus is, sort of carefully considered. I made sure that the bottom edges of the rounded bottom edges of those pink squiggles sort of overlapped nicely and, was arranged in a way that was pleasing to the eye. Speaking of eyes, around this part of the recording, I decided, you know, it might be cool since we're dealing with such psychedelic shapes to sort of expose this meditator's third eye. And so that's what we go ahead and do. We copy one of those eye setups out of the symmetry object, open it up, add a little pupil there, and that's feeling a lot more interesting. So after removing the shoulders and adding this third eye, I felt like we had come a long way in terms of getting this thing closer to its final stage. And it was a little bit different from what I'd set out to do, but like I mentioned, you should allow yourself the flexibility to change and evolve a piece as you go on. And now I feel like here we're getting a little bit closer. We're starting to come together. I've got a sense of where the final piece needs to be. And now it's about finessing those details and making sure all these abstract shapes sort of round out the composition in a nice way. So I'm just adding in additional pieces. Most of this is done by just copying and pasting the existing primitives. I find that it's typically a lot easier to just duplicate something that's close to where you need it to be. So instead of creating a new sphere and scaling it down and moving it over near another sphere, I'll just copy that sphere over. It's much, much faster. And so I felt that these, you know, we were going too far directly into the top right corner of this composition. I wanted to spread it out a little bit further and occupy more of the top edge of the screen and the bottom edge, or sorry, the right edge of the screen. So sometimes it feels a little bit static to have your elements go at like a 45-degree angle directly to the corner of the screen. So I'm trying to spread these shapes out and have them grow as they near the edge of the composition and create more of like a funnel or a triangular shape as they point towards the head. And you can see as I add those pieces to sort of widen the top right edge of this set of shapes, it feels a lot better right away. Here, you know, I add in some ambient occlusion because I think we needed a little bit in the shapes. We needed a little bit of extra definition in these abstract shapes. But to be honest, I wasn't loving what they were doing to the areas around the eye. They were a little bit too harsh, and they were pushing some additional darkness into the areas of the face that I don't think needed it. So I think I wind up using some compositing tags to disable ambient occlusion from the character's face and just keep it in the abstract shapes above. And so as I'm getting close to the end here and feeling pretty good about this set of primitives and abstract shapes going off to the top right, I think, you know, some scale, some playing with scale will help out a lot here. So I take a sphere and I make it really much smaller than the others and duplicate it around, fill in some of those little negative spaces in between shapes. And it was feeling like the bit of detail that the piece really needed. So now I make sure my alpha is turned on in my export settings, and I double the size of the piece, and I'm ready to export a final rendering. Now, a couple notes here. First of all, I will frequently choose a background color in Cinema 4D, but since I wanted to go a little bit heavier on the Photoshop retouching this week, I wound up just leaving an alpha channel and allowing myself the flexibility to decide later on which color it was going to be. And you can see here I'm playing with different colors, trying to decide where it needs to be. Ultimately, I land on this dark blue color, which seems to work well, provides some nice contrast, both with the face and with the abstract shapes on the top right. And then what I wanted to do is add another little bit of detail and just come in and do some digital painting over these abstract shapes. There's no more realism that needed to be added, but I felt that these could do with a bit of hatching, a bit of exaggeration, and just, you know, some additional details. This isn't something I always do, but it could be really fun. And, you know, beyond needing to add a little bit of detail and wanting to have a little fun, there wasn't really any reasoning to do this. Sometimes you just got to sort of follow your gut and make stuff because you think it might work or you think it might be fun to work on. You know, this is a practice. I'm not doing this for a client who needs a specific brand look duplicated, and I'm not doing it, you know, for any other reason than to hone my skills and try new things and sort of expand my abilities. So this is what I felt like doing this week. And I'm glad I did. I think, you know, it's fairly rudimentary. This collection of shapes. I mean, I think it's working. It's satisfying to a certain extent, but I think it did need a little bit of additional detail. I also wanted to draw your eye to these bright shapes, and I think one way to do that and push that a little further is to increase the contrast. So what I'm doing is just really loosely, like kind of scribbling in some darker areas around these areas in the top right, just providing a little bit of additional contrast. And I made a new layer, and I hit Command-click on the thumbnail in the toolbar, or in a layers palette rather, and that selected the alpha channel there, and allowed me to mask off all the areas that I didn't want to paint in. You saw I drew in those big, dark, fuzzy areas really rather quickly. What I also did was I duplicated this character's face and threw a noise filter on it. And what I'm doing now is I threw a noise filter on this whole image, and then I deleted everything. Well, I should say I masked it all off, and what I'm doing now is painting back in areas that I felt needed a little bit of detail. You can see it might be a little bit tough to see in the screen recording. What I did was just painted back in those noisy areas to give you a little bit of additional detail and texture. Also cropped the composition and got it to a place where it was working just a little bit better. You can see some of those noisy details here. You can see the way the really smooth and clean kind of primitive shapes are enhanced and I think made a little bit more interesting by some of these scribbles and hatches and noisy patches. It was a fun exploration. It wasn't exactly what I set out to make. It was, I had sort of a rough idea as to the type of piece I'd want to make this week. And I think it came out a little better than I was anticipating, to be honest, because I allowed myself the flexibility to move and push and deviate from the original plan a little bit, and I would encourage you to do the same. If you like this video, please hit like and subscribe. If you have any further questions, don't hesitate to drop one in the comments below. If you want to keep up with me and the work that I'm doing, please check me out on Instagram at DLGNCE. And until next week, this is Stuart saying goodbye. Thanks.